tax codes. Whether you know it or not, if you are an employee, you will have a tax code. The revenue are responsible for issuing employers with tax codes, and the aim of a tax code is to collect the right amount of tax depending on your circumstances throughout the year. I'm going to talk you through the very basics of tax codes, and I'm going to start by showing you my tax code. So I thought it would be a good place to start because hopefully if you have had your tax code, you will recognise something a bit like this. Now you'll see the first bit here, and it doesn't really matter if you can't see the actual figures, but you'll see the layout starts with the personal allowance, has something added, and for this it's my professional subscriptions, and then gives me a total, and it also then tells me my tax code that my employer will operate. Now, the first place to start when I'm explaining these is that first line. That first line is almost always going to be your personal allowance. So for the tax year that we're in right now, and for the tax year coming from the 6th of April 2022, the personal allowance is £12,570. That's usually what you're going to see as long as your income is expected to be under £100,000 for the year. That would be the start of tax codes. If your income is going to be over £100,000, the revenue are already aware of that, then you may see a different figure here. If your income is going to be over £100,000 and you don't see a different figure here, then consider taking some advice, get into contact with someone, because that could be a situation where the revenue aren't going to collect enough tax using that tax code for you. So we're going to start with that personal allowance, and then we're going to add some things to it potentially. So as you saw on my tax code, I have some professional subscriptions. Now those are subscriptions that I pay to the CIOT, which is my Institute of Taxation, for me to be able to do my job as a chartered tax advisor. It's wholly, exclusively and necessary for my job as a tax advisor, as an employee, and that means that because I'm paying those, I'm allowed to deduct them or add them to my tax code to increase my personal allowance effectively on my tax code. So professional subscriptions is something really common for me to see on a tax code. You can also see things like gift aid and pension contributions on a tax code. So this is a good idea, especially where you contribute a set amount every year to either a charity or to your pension. You can claim that relief throughout the year on your tax code. The next part of the tax code is where things can be deducted from your tax code. So when I say deducted from your tax code, what I mean is we're going to start deducting things from your personal allowance so that you get taxed more through your employment than if we weren't deducting these things. Now the most common things to see are going to be things like medical insurance benefit or any other benefits in kind. Now, generally speaking, when you first are issued with your tax code for the year, that medical insurance benefit particularly is going to be looking at the previous year. So it's not going to be 100% right, but assuming that there's not a huge fluctuation in any of your benefits in kind, it's going to be in the right ballpark. You might also see adjustments for something that used to be called 18.1, which means underpaid tax for previous tax years that's going to be collected in this year. Now that can be where in a previous tax return you've had some tax payable that's under a certain amount of money that you're allowed to what we call code out instead of paying a lump sum. So instead of paying that lump sum through self-assessment, you've said, actually, I want you to collect it gradually through my tax code. So you would see this in your tax code as an underpaid tax for previous years. You'll also see on your tax code your state pension being deducted if you're having a state pension. And you can also see something called adjustments for tax due, and the adjustment for tax due is usually says current year next to it. Now that can happen where you have had a change in tax code in the year where the revenue feel that you have previously underpaid tax. So a good example of this is where the initial tax code you've been on in the year includes your full personal allowance, but then they realise through your RTI submissions for from your employer, or because you rung them up and told them that your income's actually going to be over £100,000 and therefore you shouldn't have had your full personal allowance. In this kind of case, where they then remove your personal allowance, they will calculate the amount of tax they feel you've underpaid in the previous months and try to adjust for that in your tax code. There's a lot of press on tax codes as to what letter you have in your tax code. You can largely ignore the letter in your tax code. They mean different things. You get a different letter if you've got your state pension in there. It really doesn't make a lot of difference unless your letter is a K. So if your letter is a K, that means you've got no personal allowance left, but you've got some extra things that are adding to your income through PAYE that are going to have tax on them. So you're going to be paying more tax through your payroll than if you didn't have a K code. And any other letter will mean you probably still have some tax allowance left unless you're on 0T, which means you're neutral, you have no personal allowance and you have nothing that's being added to your code to create a K code. And there are two ways that your code can operate. The default position is cumulative, so that 1 month you have your code operated. What happens in the very first month is that 1/12 of your allowances are going to be taken into account. So those allowances work off of whatever the tax code is. If your tax code is 1270L, then that means you have £12,570, your personal allowance, of allowance in the year. That means we'll take 1/12 of that in that first month and apply your tax rate. In the second month, we'll apply 2/12 of that amount and just double check that whatever you paid last month agrees overall, and we make the adjustment in the second month. So cumulative, by the end of the year, if you've always been on a cumulative code, then and your code has stayed the same, you'll see your tax exactly the same each month. The second type of code, which you may have heard of, is called a month one, sometimes a week one code. That means that the code's going to be applied looking just at the period of pay in that period. So most people are paid monthly, that's why we hear of month one codes. And instead of looking in, say, that second month as at 2/12 of the allowance, instead what we're going to look at is just 1/12 of the allowance again, and we're going to keep doing that throughout the year. What or why that sometimes is issued by the revenue is especially late code changes in the year. If there's a late code change that would result in quite a bit of tax being recouped from you if it was operated cumulatively, they may opt to do a month one so that you don't suddenly end up with no net pay. If you're not sure which type of code you're on, you should be able to find this on your payslip. You'll be able to find the code itself, and also if it's a month one, you'll see an M1 or a W1, week one, after the code itself. Now, codes are meant to be really simple and easy to understand, but actually I've found throughout my time as a personal tax advisor that they're often the point at which people can get very confused, and it can be confusing if there's different types of income going on for you, or if there's been changes through the year. If there's anything that you don't understand about your tax code, please get somebody to explain it to you, get an advisor. Please feel free to drop me an email if you have any questions about your tax code. A good thing to note is that if you already have a tax advisor, they don't get copies of your code. We can access copies of your code online, but the revenue don't send them separately to us. So unless you tell us that you've got a new code, we're not necessarily going to know about it. So please send over your tax code. Generally, that's going to be part of your self-assessment fee that your advisor's already charging you, that they'll probably be able to look at that code without extra charge. Check with them. But certainly if there's anything you're unsure of, please take advice.